Seattle News Weekly from Fox 13.
Welcome to Seattle News Weekly, and this week we are taking a deep dive into the First Amendment in the United States. What does free speech actually mean, and how does it apply to the current media landscape in this country? We are bringing in a First Amendment scholar. Seattle University's Caitlin Carlson is the chair of the Seattle University Department of Communications and Media. Caitlin, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Now, we had you on the show a couple of weeks ago, and I wanted to get more into this because you had some really important things to say. Let's just absolutely baseline it from the beginning. When was the First Amendment of the Constitution established, and what was the reason behind establishing it?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. I think so. The First Amendment is obviously part of the Bill of Rights and was ratified along with the other amendments at the kind of birth of our country. But I think a lot of people don't realize that the First Amendment is only first because when the founders were putting together the Bill of Rights, the first two amendments they proposed actually didn't pass. And so I think we have this kind of reverence for free speech and press freedom that we don't extend to other rights afforded in the Constitution, like the right to vote, for example, or the Equal Protection Clause, which came along after the Civil War. So I think it's important for folks to understand, yes, the First Amendment is first, but the Bill of Rights actually affords all kinds of protection, including privacy protections and things like that. It is important to keep in mind that the First Amendment protects not only the right for people to express themselves, so the right to free speech, but also the right to press freedom, the right for people to assemble, and then also the right to practice your religion, and then to be free from kind of the government establishing a national religion. So there are actually 5 rights included in the First Amendment. And as a media scholar, the ones that I'm most concerned with are the right to free press and the right to free expression.
Okay, so when we talk about the First Amendment, what kind of speech, what kind of expression does it protect, and which kind of speech or expression does it not?
Absolutely. So I think there's a bit of a perception that when the First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law abridging the right of expression or of press freedom, that there really are no laws. And that's just not the case. So there are actually a handful of laws that tell us where the lines are between, for example, protected expression and something that then becomes conduct. Or we have certain types of sexual expression that are prohibited. So things like true threats. So if you threaten someone, that's not protected speech. If you incite illegal action, that's not protected speech. Child pornography is certainly not protected expression. So there are these areas that are not protected by the First Amendment that the government actually regulates, that there are laws that have been created by Congress or by state legislatures and signed into law by the executive, whether that's the president or the governor. There are also laws that are essentially torts. So torts are kinds of laws that regulate harm that people or organizations do to one another. And so we actually have a large body of tort law that exists that impacts speech. So for example, defamation, right? That you can't necessarily say something about somebody that's not true, that damages their reputation. They then have the right to bring a lawsuit against you. So there are all kinds of areas. We also think about copyright as an area, trademark that is regulated by the government, and isn't speech that's afforded kind of blanket protection under the First Amendment.
We are all going to deal with speech or expressions at one time or another that we personally don't agree with. But when it comes to hateful speech, hateful expressions, what are the guardrails surrounding that?
Absolutely. So the United States is actually unique in that we allow hateful expression under the First Amendment. So unless speech crosses a line into one of the areas I mentioned earlier, which specifically include true threats. So if I threaten bodily harm against another individual, or incitement, if I incite people to immediate illegal action, and that immediate part is really important when we talk about that. Fighting words, also those kind of personally abusive epithets that provoke an immediate violent response, things like harassment. Sometimes what we think of as hateful speech can cross into one of those areas and then it's no longer protected. But I think it's really important when people talk about hate speech as scholars who study this, we really think of hate speech as speech that maligns people based on a fixed identity characteristic. So me saying, I don't like your politics, or I don't like that you are not a Seahawks fan, or whatever those things are, right? That's not considered hate speech. It's really got to be speech that attacks people based on things like their race, their gender identity, their sexual orientation. So in a lot of other countries, they have laws that prohibit what we would call incitement to hatred. And in the United States, we just don't have that. So that speech is protected. And it's really important, I think, for people to realize that one of the founding principles of First Amendment jurisprudence, so laws or cases that have come before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has said, here's kind of the lines of what is protected and what isn't, is viewpoint discrimination is not allowed by the government. So the government rarely can say, we don't like this point of view. The government can create what we call content neutral laws. So for example, the government can't say, I don't like protest signs that include this language. They might be able to say something like, for example, no protesting outside of funerals, right? Content neutral versus content-based laws. And that's a really, I think, important distinction for people to be aware of.
Okay, we all know that social media can be a cesspool, particularly in a really divided country like we are in right now. What free speech protections are there? You mentioned some of them, in regards to social media, I'm assuming, but what legal guardrails are there on speech on social media? We know, pornographic content would not be allowed, for example. The threatening content would not be allowed. But aside from that, what are, because it is kind of the Wild West when we're talking about social media these days.
Yeah, I actually think it's really important for people to recognize that social media are private virtual spaces. So the government actually doesn't get to make content moderation rules for platforms like X or Facebook or any of those kind of things. So actually, platforms are free to go much further than what the First Amendment would allow, right? So the First Amendment simply has these prohibitions against, for example, like we talked about, incitement, true threats, fighting words, that sort of thing. Platforms can go quite a bit further and say no hate speech on our platform. They could literally say anything. They could say, I'm wearing a green shirt. We don't want anybody talking about the color green. And they'd be well within their First Amendment rights to do that because that is a private virtual space. They are free to set whatever rules. And when you click, I agree to go on to whatever platform it is, you're basically saying, yeah, I'm going to play by whatever content moderation rules you've established for the privilege of going on this site.
The right to a free and fair press to hold the powerful accountable is afforded in the Constitution. But when you have the powerful going after the media, calling them fake news, sue them, threaten to take their licenses away.
Yeah.
How far can the government go to silence media criticism?
Well, I think what we're talking about in this case is what's traditionally been considered constitutional and what is really outside of the norms of what we're seeing. So, obviously the government, government officials also have a right to free expression. And so saying things like, oh, they're fake news or anything like that, that's protected expression, right? I think where it becomes problematic and what we've seen recently are some of these libel suits that really are designed to silence critics. So without going too far into the weed, many states have laws that prohibit what we call strategic lawsuits against public participation. So there's legislation in many states that says, when you have a lawsuit that is designed to silence people, there is a particular defense or like an out that people can use. And so what we've seen recently is actually a lot of media companies acquiescing to some of these suits and instead kind of, I think Meta, for example, didn't necessarily settle the suit, but they made a donation to the president's presidential library, some of that kind of stuff. So we're seeing, I think, not necessarily kind of traditional means of pressuring media, but we're seeing kind of these almost like backhanded or backroom ways of saying, hey, if you play ball, I'll leave you alone. If you don't play ball, if you continue to do things I don't like, there's going to be consequences. And that kind of ties us back to what we saw with the FCC and Brendan Carr, kind of this heavy-handed, we can do this the easy way or we can do this the hard way. If you Sinclair, Nexstar, ABC don't play ball, we might threaten your merger that's potentially about to go through for something like that.
Okay, so now we're getting into media consolidation, and there are concerns that certain entities could take over a number of television stations in a certain market. For example, we have seen the decline of newspapers in this country, and what happens is we have fewer voices and more consolidation among major companies producing a lot of media content. What is your biggest concern about that, and what the FCC is considering right now?
Yeah, so there's actually, I think, a couple different issues at play here. So what we saw with the Jimmy Kimmel kind of threat from FCC chairperson Brendan Carr felt like, Kimmel is engaged in speech that the government, whether it's the executive branch in terms of the president or the FCC, disagrees with. And so you see this threat to quote unquote pull licenses. That's not something that traditionally happens. Stations very rarely lose their licenses. What I think really the threat was Nexstar, which is a large corporation that owns hundreds of television stations, is slated to purchase another company, Tegna, which also owns hundreds of television stations. And so the FCC is really responsible for approving that because it goes against what has traditionally been restrictions on ownership. So in the past and up until, we've seen big shifts throughout history. So, for example, in 1996, we saw a big change. 2017 was probably the largest in recent history where the government and the FCC under Republican administrations have started to roll back limits on ownership. So in the past, there have been rules that said, you can't own, for example, three television stations or more than 8 radio stations in a given market, because then we have this consolidation of viewpoints. We have one organization kind of telling us what news is newsworthy. We have a lack of competition. We have fewer journalists working to kind of tell the stories of a local area. And so I think one of the biggest issues I'm kind of concerned about is the government threatening the First Amendment rights of broadcasters, but also kind of stepping back is this consolidation in media is leading to fewer and fewer voices, fewer and fewer journalists doing the thing that we as a democracy rely on journalists like yourself to do, is to really serve as that fourth branch of government, to be a watchdog on our systems, whether that's our institutions of government, of corporations, to really investigate on behalf of the people what's happening. And so when we don't have that, we just don't have the news at our fingertips to make good decisions and have a functioning democracy.
And what's particularly tricky right now is that there's a lot of fake news out there, right? I mean, the dissemination of misinformation, disinformation, and in some cases, it's coming from our own government. So what's your biggest concern in terms of the idea of partisan media and so many different sources out there saying a lot of different things, opinions being reported as facts? I mean, is it just a situation of consumers needing to be smarter about where they consume their material?
Well, I think there is a question of media literacy, but I think when we think about our commercially driven media system, so we have very few public media options, which means that this is not a new problem. So you can actually trace back to cable news, right? So when you started to have a 24-hour news cycle and you started to have stations that needed to fill time, one of the things that Fox or MSNBC discovered even back in the 90s was partisan news keeps people's eyeballs, right? And then I can sell those eyeballs to advertisers. And we see the same thing on social media, right? That when we have divisive or aggressive or anger, even fake news, that keeps people on longer. And it's important to know about fake news, disinformation, misinformation, whatever you want to call it. That's not actually illegal. So it's not possible for the government to regulate what's true and what's not true. That really happens through libel suits. So for example, when Fox News was after the, I believe, 2020 election saying, the election was stolen, et cetera, Smartmatic, which is one of and Dominion voting systems, both of these make voting machines. They ended up suing Fox for $780 million. I mean, they won a big settlement because Fox News hosts are on there saying, these machines were faulty, that sort of thing. So that's really one of the checks and balances we have on quote unquote mis and disinformation in the news. But there really isn't like a government intervention, because you can see how dangerous that would be to say we don't necessarily trust the government or people in power to decide what's accurate or what's not, because at that point they might just say anything I don't like is fake news. And I do think you see that coming from this administration to simply say any news I don't like is quote unquote fake news.
Now, Dr. Carlson, you did mention the right to peacefully assemble, and that's afforded in the First Amendment. But what are the First Amendment protections for protesters?
So I think one of the things for people to be aware of is it really matters where the protests are happening. So when people are gathered in a park or on sidewalks on what we consider a traditional public forum, peaceful protest is largely protected. That looks different when people go into, for example, a private space or a private building. So I'm here on Seattle University's campus. We're a private school. We have much more discretion to say protesters are not allowed in different spaces.
And so when the government goes after universities saying, we don't like what they termed anti-Semitic protests happening on your campus, and we're going to defund you. And we've seen this happen at a number of college campuses. What's your take on that?
I mean, I think it's incredibly problematic, but the legality, I think, is a little bit more of a gray area. I believe the Supreme Court has said, when the administration goes after individuals and looks at their immigration status based on the content of their protests, that's been deemed illegal. But the funding question is a lot more complicated. And so obviously, I think it's not in the spirit of the First Amendment. And I think we have a long and rich history of people being able to criticize the government. And I think it gets really dangerous when students or people of all walks of life feel like they can't speak their mind peacefully in places that have been deemed traditional public forums, which includes public campuses.
So much interesting stuff, and we could get into more. But Dr. Caitlin Carlson from Seattle University, thank you so much for your insight on this. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Pleasure to chat with you.
And don't forget, we have new episodes of Seattle News Weekly podcast that come out every Thursday. You can watch them on the Fox local app, fox13seattle.com, or the Fox 13 Seattle YouTube channel. You can listen to them anywhere you get your podcast, and we will see you back here next week.
Seattle News Weekly is available wherever you get your podcast.